Welcome to the MetaView podcast. Here, these non-fungible conversations, they will yield you great knowledge and perspective. But beware, they might also make your brain go boom. So watch your step, because this rabbit hole goes deep. Good luck and have fun. Welcome, Stephen Reid, to the MetaView podcast. Care to share a brief intro to yourself for people who don't know you?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me, Pete. It's good to be here. So, I describe myself as a teacher, technologist, and coach. On the teaching side of things, over the past few years, I've taught a number of courses, including How to DAO, Tools for the Regenerative Renaissance, the Promise of Decentralization, Intro to Web3. I'm currently studying for a professional certificate in machine learning and artificial intelligence with UC Berkeley. And once I finish that, I'll also be teaching an Introduction to AI course. I am a coach. I work one-on-one with people on their hopes and dreams. And for some years now, I've been involved in other projects in the Web3 space. I currently am involved with a project called Metacrisis.xyz. I'm trying to bring more kind of metacrisis thinking into the Web3 space and explore how Web3 technologies could be useful in solving some metacrisis related issues. I also lead the development of a platform called Dandelion, which is for regenerative events and co-created gatherings, which emerged from the UK Psychedelic Society, which I set up almost 10 years ago, first as a campaign for the legal regulation of psychedelics, but now it's really a kind of events, arts, cultural organisation, and there's tons of interesting events on the Dandelion platform for inner and outer regeneration. So yeah, I have my fingers in many pies, as you can tell.
Yeah, I didn't know that you co-founded the Dandelion. I was just on the website the other day. I was trying to create a page for MetaFest.
Yes, yeah. Well, if I'd love your feedback at some point, but I know that Regens Unite are just about to use it for their upcoming event in London. It does accept crypto payments, either Coinbase Commerce or like Optimism, Gnosis Chain, other EVM chains. So I'm hoping it will become better known within the Web3 community, although that's not really where it started. And the platform is created and owned and run by a not-for-profit worker cooperative. I love DAOs. I also love traditional co-ops, and I think actually they have more in common than many people realize, at best at least.
Yeah, and co-ops know a lot more about DAOing than the DAO people, than most DAO people.
Right. Well, many co-ops have had to kind of figure out one way or another. The human element, the supreme importance of quality interpersonal relationships in running such organizations. And I think DAOs are often in a process of sort of rediscovering that that very important fact over the past couple of years.
Right. And where do you teach all that stuff? You mentioned the How to DAO. You mentioned a bunch of other stuff.
Well, the How to DAO course was actually funded by DAO House, or DAO House's Uber House. Tools for the Regenerative Renaissance was funded by a project on the Telos blockchain called Seeds. And then some of the other projects I've just offered via the Psychedelic Society, and they've been advertised on Dandelion, which is at dandelion.events.
Got it. So they're on different platforms.
Yes, but typically they will end up on Dandelion at some point. So that's where, if people are interested, they can find the Introduction to AI course that I'm teaching soon.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, I will follow up about all the links, and we will include them in the show notes. And I would also love to plug in Dandelion events somehow into Metagame, but we can get into that later. And I wanted to ask, how long have you been in this sort of metacrisis space, and how did you find out about it in the first place?
Yeah, well, I have been listening to Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jordan Hall and Jamie Wheel and some of these key metacrisis thinkers for probably since 2016, 2017. Typically longer than many people in the Web3 space have kind of been aware of them, although I'm sure there's some exceptions. I'm good friends with the guys, David Filler and Alexander Biner, that started Rebel Wisdom, which I think you probably
Oh,
are
cool.
aware of. And so I think I first became aware of their thinking of like, Daniel, Jordan and Jamie's thinking through on Rebel Wisdom YouTube channel. And then kind of went down that rabbit hole and sort of listened and read to a lot of what they were putting out. Also been to a couple of the Emerge conferences. Emerge is a kind of network of Metacrisis or Metacrisis adjacent and metamodern thinkers. And the last big event of that was in Berlin towards the end of 2021. And really appreciated the people that I've met there, including actually my now partner, who I've been now been seeing for the past 18 months. So I appreciate the kind of the intellectual connections, and in this instance, like also the connection of a partner to share life with.
I love it. You're really plugged into a bunch of different networks.
Yeah, it's been, actually the Web3 stuff came later. Really, I've been aware of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies for some time since I was using them to sort of purchase psychedelics from the dark web. It was like 2011 time, I guess, but it wasn't till like 2017 that I was like, okay, this crypto stuff is actually really interesting, and kind of got spent a bit more time getting my head around it. And I do consider myself a bit of a bridge builder, network weaver, joining the dots between different disciplines and thinkers and communities and so on. And that's been quite useful in the context of Metacrisis.xyz.
Yeah, I think it's definitely useful in general, like to build bridges between these communities that kind of have more in common than people think, like in terms of philosophical alignment.
Yeah.
And it's been great to see like Metacrisis becoming known in the Web3 space.
Yeah, it's sometimes people talk about Metacrisis as a hyper object, right? Like something that it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around fully. I think Kevin Iwaki has used this story of blind men touching an elephant, and depending on what part of the elephant that the blind man touches, it can imagine that it's something completely different. And different communities have their own way of talking about what we could call the meta-crisis. In the Web3 community, very often it's been talked about as a coordination failure, which is language you also find in from meta-crisis thinkers. I think one very powerful concept that I think we hear more about in the Web3 community now is the concept of the multipolar trap, which possibly your listeners are already familiar with it. But that's one example of, I think, a very useful concept that now seems to be getting more consideration in the Web3 community.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. You want to describe? I mean, most of the listeners probably know about it already, but there's always the ones that we need to teach these concepts. You want to,
Multipolar trap is essentially a generalization of the prisoner's dilemma. So let's think of an example. So you have a load of villages around the lake that have been sustainably fishing the lake for generations, and then one village starts fishing more than its fair share. And then the second village on the lake might kind of notice that this first village is taking more than it should. And this is what I find most interesting, that second village then, they think, well, we're the good guys. We don't want to overfish the lake, but if anyone's going to do it, it might as well be us, because we don't want these first bad guys to kind of end up with all the fish. So even though we're the good guys, we're going to have to start doing this. And other villages might think the same, and before you know it, everyone's overfishing, and then there's no fish left in the lake for anyone at all. But the thing I think is really interesting is the multipolar trap is very often a story about how even good people are driven to do bad things. It's like even those second and third and fourth villages, they might not really want to overfish the lake, but they somehow feel forced into it by almost this kind of impersonal, like otherworldly force, even, and that force is sometimes spoken of as like a deity called Moloch, which of course is spoken about a fair bit in the Web3 community. There was a Moloch DAO that people might be aware of from a few years back, and that language is still quite often invoked. So I think the Moloch is actually a very useful concept to pointing at how this is not as simple as just any one person wanting to do the right thing or not. There's actually kind of a systemic problem, like a coordination failure that we need very often societal level, in this instance kind of lake level mechanisms to solve.
Right, yeah, definitely. And zooming out a bit, then Moloch is already pretty zoomed out. But I wanted to ask you to give a brief intro to Metacrisis itself, the concept.
Yeah, so looking around the world, people will be familiar that there's a number of global challenges that we face right now: climate change, nuclear proliferation, ocean acidification, a number of other ecological challenges. You might include then like gross wealth and income inequality in that basket. And the Metacrisis thesis is that actually there are common drivers, or in the language of many Metacrisis thinkers, like generator functions to these set of crises. And actually it would be much more useful to really understand those underlying generator functions and seek to solve for them, rather than seeking to kind of solve climate change or solve nuclear proliferation and so on. This is a couple of reasons for this, at least, I guess. One is that it's potentially easier, potentially good news. Like if it is the case that these many interconnected crises have common drivers, then if we can sort out the common drivers, then potentially we solve many crises at once, or you make progress on many fronts in one go. The other insight, I guess, is that we don't want to get into a situation where we solve one crisis at the expense of others. In some sense, it would it's always relatively simple to solve one thing if you have a narrow enough metric. Like that's really the dilemma now of geoengineering in the context of the climate crisis. If we're like, okay, well, we simply want to reduce like ocean temperatures, for example, is a hot topic right now, then we might think, okay, let's just scatter some substance on the surface of the ocean. No problem, we've reduced surface temperature, sea surface temperatures, and but of course that is very likely to have all kinds of downstream effects, knock-on effects that might make other crises worse. So in that sense, the metacrisis or metacrisis thinking is joined up thinking, it is holistic thinking, it's systems thinking. It's doing our very best to understand how our interventions in any one particular domain are likely to affect other domains. And whilst acknowledging that is an impossible task, really, or rather, you're never going to get that exactly right. However, you can do better or worse at that. We currently live in a society where I would suggest many people are not putting nearly enough attention to these systemic consequences of their actions. And whilst that will never be perfect, it's something we could get better at. We could get better at really seeking to take account of what are currently known as externalities. Externalities, of course, have the problem of plausible deniability, which is another kind of really interesting generator function of the metacrisis. That it's very often easy to say, take that geoengineering example, like, oh, well, I was just trying to do the right thing. I was just trying to reduce, sea temperatures, and I had no idea that by putting metal into the ocean, it would, cause this problem or that problem. It's like, well, maybe if you had thought about it, you would have realized it was a problem, So if at best, by making this kind of systemic thinking widespread, ubiquitous, then people can no longer kind of use that excuse, can no longer plead ignorance that, I didn't realize that this intervention was going to have these downstream consequences. It would be great to create a culture where everyone is aware of that possibility and does their very best to work out how exactly or what exactly those downstream consequences might be. So there you go. That's a brief intro.
Yeah, that's a good intro. And yeah, like one of the most important parts, I guess, about the concept of Metacrisis is getting people to think holistically. And yeah, I wanted to use the same example of pumping the gas into the atmosphere. And yeah, we need to make this crisis solving not turn into a game of whack-a-mole where you just smack at the problem at one place and just pops in another.
And just to make the link, like with kind of the multipolar trap in the context of climate crisis, like you can argue that the way the multipolar trap is showing up there is that countries are hesitant, resistant to be the first to decarbonize their economies because they think, well, if we decarbonize at great expense and other countries don't bother, then we're going to be disadvantaged, and which has created this, this coordination problem of the best or maybe even only way to do it is, well, everyone needs to decarbonize at once. But what exactly is the coordination mechanism for ensuring that does happen, such that no country feels like it's going to fall behind by diverting resources to kind of transitioning its economy away from fossil fuels and so on.
Right. Yeah, it's a sad state. I guess now it's we had this problem in the market for decades, if not I don't know how much longer than that. Of like, it's always the ones who cut the most corners and the ones who maximize the profits that win, and then kind of incentivize others to do the same. It's definitely a tough problem. How do you think this problem could be, this perverse incentive could be reverted?
Yeah, well, I mean, just thinking more abstractly, I think it's about both inner change, inner development, we might say, and the development of more effective coordination mechanisms over time. So when I say inner development, I mean kind of personal growth work of expanding our sensitivity and compassion and awareness of the importance, sacredness even of all life on this planet, such that for any individual that has done that or that individual is much less likely to take a decision which would negatively impact life on this planet. It's just come naturally to them, to avoid taking action that would have those consequences. But it's not that simple, as I was saying earlier, like the multipolar trap in many ways is a story about how even good people are driven to do bad things. And that's why we also, I think, need ongoing research on new ways of coordinating and kind of escaping these traps. But my sense is that we really need both, actually. And the Web3 community, of course, is very often focused on those, on the external, on what clever coordination mechanisms and sort of systems can we come up with. And I've sometimes found like a little bit lacking in the kind of attention to the inner dimensions. And for me, they are very much joined up. And I mean, you can easily make that criticism the other way around for other communities. For example, another community I mentioned, the Psychedelic Society and the psychedelic community. You can find many instances there of people maybe just getting a little bit stuck and lost in like just constantly, like seeking to do this kind of inner work and personal growth work, and never quite getting round to the question of, okay, how do I actually have an impact on the world? How can I actually put some of this into action? But I think there's a balance to be struck.
Right, definitely. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this because I definitely noticed this, like both, as you said, like in the Web3 community, or not just Web3 community, but other related communities that are all about, okay, we need to solve these systemic problems by focusing on solving the problems themselves, and they don't look at themselves as like people who the people also need to grow. And like I said, like in this, on the other side, we have this sort of these new age movements which are all about the inner work and like advancing as a human being rather than like trying to focus on systemic changes. And we really need both to to get anywhere.
And my sense, Pete, is that you're someone that, kind of is already quite aware of that dynamic. And from what I saw of MetaFest, which I know you're putting a lot of time into right now, that actually you do have people coming from both of those worlds, or many different worlds, contributing to both kind of inner development and the kind of outer development. For example, I saw that Hansi Freinacht of Metamoderna is one of the speakers at MetaFest. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so of course, for people that aren't familiar with Hansi and Metamoderna, like that's at least the first book and best known book, The Listening Society, is very much focused on, has one big focus on that kind of inner development side of things. Actually, the idea of metamodernism applies as much to cultures and civilizations as it does to individuals. But certainly Hansi is well outside the Web3 space. So I'm really happy to see that you're bringing together a real diversity of thinkers there in a few weeks' time.
Yeah. I created a grant actually for the project that he started called the ARC, the Arch-Disciplinary Research Center. But it didn't do very well in the GitCon, the last GitCon round. Maybe that's better next time.
Well, and then this was the Metacrisis round.
Yeah.
So this is what I mentioned. I've been working on Metacrisis to XYZ, and one of the main tasks there has been coordinating. Well, so far just one quadratic funding round, but the intention is for there to be more. The first one was an experiment, and in many ways a failed experiment, I would say. In the first instance, simply due to the fact it was on Ethereum mainnet and we had such high gas costs that it didn't really have the intended effect of being a genuine exercise in collective intelligence of the Metacrisis community. It seemed to have more to do with who already has friends that have Ether in their wallets and already have Gitcoin passports and so on. And most of the projects that did well were kind of OG projects that were already quite well connected. And but in the future, I hope that changes. And I think just one simple thing is moving to a layer 2. I guess it will probably be public goods network now at this point. The next round will be run on making it very cheap and hopefully increasingly easy to donate. I think this might be a much better exercise in collective intelligence of the broader Metacrisis community. I personally would love to see things like ARC funded in the future.
Yeah, the last round was definitely tricky, to say the least. Yeah, it wasn't possible to donate anything, any smaller amounts, which kind of defeated the purpose of the matching. But yeah, hopefully it will be solved with the L2 solutions. And like the way I usually explain the Metamodernism, or at least the book one from Hansi, is kind of the flip side of the Metacrisis. So it recognizes all the same problems, but instead of focusing directly on the big systemic changes, it focuses on how to help each individual grow. And then with the idea that if we had a lot more people who are better developed, then it would be easier to solve all of these problems, because you'd have people who are actually interested and capable of doing so.
That's certainly a really important part of it, and that's the part that I was thinking of when I was speaking a bit before. But then as I was speaking, I was thinking of things like the book Reinventing Organizations, which is actually more based on integral theory, which is slightly different to metamodernism, but there's a big overlap, as I guess you're aware. And so, Reinventing Organizations and the concept of teal organizations, I think, is very powerful. It's actually required reading for all new colleagues at the Worker Cooperative that I work with. We seek to work in this teal way. And of course, a big part of that is the author there even suggests really to work for an organization to be teal, a critical mass of the individuals have also to be teal, or kind of working at that level of development. And I think integral theory metamodernism is an extremely useful, extremely powerful, and actually quite practical concept in my experiments and discoveries. And we'd be keen for that to become better known in the Web3 space.
It's definitely one of my favorite, if not my favorite book the past few years.
Reinventing Organizations or Listening Society?
The Listening Society and the Nordic Ideology. But Reinventing Organizations also a great book. I would definitely recommend anybody who is in the DAO space or the Metacrisis space. And would you care to give a brief intro to Metamodernism for those who don't know it?
Well, let me see. So I think I'd probably be more comfortable like talking about reinventing organizations actually, which and in terms of it being a developmental stage theory, there's a heavy overlap. So shall I spend a couple of minutes on that?
Sure.
Yeah. So in many ways, I think it's more kind of accessible talking about it at the level of organizations. So the idea in reinventing organizations is that human cultures and human organizations have developed over time in somewhat predictable and recognizable sequence involving growing complexity and different forms of order. So have so-called red organizations, examples of which might be street gangs or mafia that are based on hierarchies of violence, essentially. Like the strongest, the most violent people like rise to the top and essentially exert control over the organization via that means. Later, and these are some of the earliest forms of organization. Not saying that all, it's certainly not the case that all kind of indigenous societies were organized in those ways, but maybe we could say like early kind of, Western organizations at least. Then you have amber organizations, examples of which might be armies, like military forces, or churches, where there are still typically very strong hierarchies, but the hierarchies are not exclusively based on violence, at least. They're often based on an appeal to a higher power, like the people at the top of the church are there in some sense because they are supposedly like closer to God, or they have some stronger connection to God. Or in the case of an army, the higher power essentially is the nation state, is patriotism that gives people some credibility or legitimacy supposedly to be at the top of these hierarchies. Next, you have orange organizations, and which the classic example of which is the kind of modern corporation. So still typically very hierarchical, but the hierarchies here, at least supposedly, are based on merit. There's like it's the meritocracy, and anyone with enough talent can rise to the top if they're playing, at least if they're playing by the rules of the system, which often means profit maximization. If you're the kind of person that can help a corporation make loads of money, then you deserve to be at the top of that organization. And then you have green organizations next. So this would be like many kind of modern NGOs, maybe kind of many of the kind of modern tech companies that. And the analogy here would be like organization as family. Like there is a genuine sense of care for employees. Employees might enjoy really good benefits, like holiday and good quality sick pay and time off when they have children and so on. And there might be at least some attempts to actually consult employees on how their desires for the future of the organization. However, most of the time, green organizations are still ultimately owned by one person, a small number of people, or possibly controlled, run by like either a small one or a small group of people, or alternatively absentee shareholders for the sake of profit maximization. And then you get teal organizations. So the analogy here is organization as living system. Teal organizations often arranged not as hierarchies, but as circles of circles, using systems like sociocracy or holocracy or similar. And at best, teal organizations are actually also owned by the people that are contributing to them. They have this sense of truly like being an organism with all the different parts of the organism working in some kind of harmony, rather than there being this central command of any description. So my sense is that like even if people aren't familiar with that framework or that language, so that people have this intuition that is what many DAOs could be, or they would like their DAO to be, is a teal organization that is working in this kind of organic, fluid fashion that we might liken to a kind of biological organism, and to have done away with hierarchies and ownership structures and even kind of goals in terms of profit maximization of past organizations. So that's integral theory like applied to organizations, but you can apply similar stage theory to individuals or even to kind of whole human cultures. It's one of the things that makes it so interesting and powerful in the way that it can be applied across so many different scales.
That's a great summary. yeah, it's kind of the Bible of the future of work. So anybody who's in the DAO space and hasn't yet read it, I would definitely recommend.
Like kind of red DAOs out there, DAOs that are being governed by violence. I hope not.
I hope not, but there probably are a bunch of orange DAOs. I know there's a lot of DAOs kind of LARPing as DAOs, but really like having a corporate structure.
Yeah, decentralization theatre is this nice term that I read a few times.
Yeah.
I think it's very very useful and I mean and very toxic really. Like it's essentially kind of extractive on the goodwill of the space. You know, people are attracted to this space because they believe that wow, this is something, you know, truly decentralized where like ownership genuinely is being shared and so on. And some DAOs, it seems to me, are basically taking advantage of that goodwill and people's trust in this space. I mean, I think this at least this was the case a couple of years ago. I think many people are much more pessimistic, realistic, cautious, if you like, of the DAO label now, and which is a good thing. You know, people are just looking more carefully about, okay, like, you know, what exactly do we mean when we say this is a DAO? Just because that has that label doesn't necessarily mean it is any better than, you know, your average you know, private company or profit maximizing corporation. However, I still think there's a huge amount of potential for in the DAO space. I think at best, I would suggest DAOs are global by default or borderless multi-stakeholder cooperatives, and where both the voting rights and the economic rights are you know, being shared by the people that are actually contributing. I think we have a way to go before we kind of really realise the kind of DAO visions that were being discussed a few years back.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish there was some kind of a test or a standard or something that would make it easy to discern like which DAOs are actually DAOs and which are not. But the issue is that like we don't even have a clear definition of what is a DAO, so it's kind of an impossible task at this point.
You familiar with Joke Race?
Joke Race.
Joke Race. Yeah, Joke Race is doing some really interesting work on tokenless DAOs. So one thing what I think we can say is like clearly problematic in many cases is token-based voting, where the token can be freely bought and sold. Like, this is just obviously plutocratic. It just obviously means that anyone with enough money, if they want to, can just buy a load of tokens and then can like basically take control of the DAO. And, you know, some people are fine with that, or if, you know, often the people that are fine with that are the people that created the token and are basically just using the token as a way of exiting, you know, which I respect that some, you know, people do need to make a living, people do need to find ways of exiting, but this is clearly like it's not interesting to me. And, you know, any DAO that essentially is plutocratic and can be taken over simply by people with enough money, like, and so Joke Race are doing some really interesting experiments in where this isn't possible, and they have a bunch of kind of different alternative ways to experiment with that, which I wouldn't feel qualified to speak on in detail now. But Joke Race, also Chase Chapman, who runs, I think the podcast is called The Other Side, right? I think is doing some really interesting thinking of like DAOs beyond transferable or purchasable tokens. At least I think it's important that we give some serious thought to that area, to just avoid essentially recreating, you know, corporations as with shareholder structures as we know them.
Yeah, just on-chain corporations. We don't want that. Yeah, I've been ranting about that on this, on the other series, the Frontiers of Coordination series podcast. I've been ranting about that a lot. And yeah, in Metagame, we've been doing it one person, one vote since the beginning, although that also has its issues. So in the next instance when we're launching the DAO, we'll have like half of the voting power will be based on reputation, and the other half will be based on liquidity positions, but it also won't be like permissionless, so you won't be able to just add liquidity and instantly have voting power, but like add liquidity and then stake those tokens inside the DAO and get voted inside the DAO. So people will still need to make a proposal like, okay, why should they be given voting power?
Yeah, I think it's almost certainly there's a sweet spot, right? And the sweet spot will vary for different, you know, use cases and sectors and so on. It's probably fine in most cases to have a certain fraction of the voting and economic rights of the DAO that are able to be bought, essentially. But the idea that, become this strange default, or the last few years we've had this strange default of basically 100% of the DAO can be simply bought, which seems, I think when we look back on it, we'll think that was insane, that that's just how this first generation of DAOs were running. And I'm super happy that people are doing well, including yourselves, really experimenting with this now.
Yeah, it seems there's definitely a lot more people aware of this issue than a year or two ago. And then zooming back out again, so talking about the Metacrisis.xyz. So now people know what is the Metacrisis. So what is the Metacrisis.xyz, and what is it trying to do, or in what ways is it trying to address the Metacrisis?
Yeah, well, I would say it's still early days for Metacrisis.xyz. One role that we have established is coordinating these funding rounds, as I mentioned. Right now, Metacrisis.xyz essentially is a kind of umbrella, or is a network of different projects that are working on the Metacrisis. Right now, there aren't so many projects of Metacrisis.xyz itself, but for example, through the Metacrisis.xyz forum, I met Sam and Andrea, and we started a project called Reforge the Ring, which is based on a very interesting early 2017 blog series by Daniel Schmachtenberger on a new economic system, where he talks about this. He calls this unholy trinity of accumulation, extraction, and abstraction as key drivers of kind of economic crisis, or if you like, kind of the problems that our economic system is creating in the world. So we participated in the first Metacrisis.xyz funding round, and we've just recorded the first episode of our podcast, and we're lining up further guests now. So in that sense, Metacrisis.xyz for us was it was a place to meet, it was a place to start bringing in some funding, and just sort of work out and launch an idea that we're now all quite passionate about. So that's certainly one possibility for the future, that we might kind of actually organize kind of meetups and matchmaking sessions and kind of accelerators and so on for people that are interested in Metacrisis related problems to find the others and to actually get going on projects. And it might be that Metacrisis.xyz itself does actually develop some more concrete streams of work beyond simply coordinating others. There is a wiki.metacrisis.xyz which has a bit of AI magic sprinkled on it, and has kind of time-stamped transcripts of all of Daniel Schmachtenberger's talks on the Metacrisis and so on, along with definitions of many Metacrisis related terms that are mentioned in those talks. So that's the beginning in a way of this mapping the Metacrisis project, which we've had a few meetings about in Metacrisis.xyz already. I think there are many more ways we could be mapping the Metacrisis beyond simply kind of mapping the language, which is what the wiki is about. And so there's Brandon Norgard and Andrea, who I mentioned already, have been writing some good stuff about that. So that's something you may see coming out of Metacrisis.xyz over the coming months more. What ways of mapping the Metacrisis, bearing in mind this thing about it being a hyper object, I don't think there's any one true way to map the Metacrisis, one right way, but you could create different maps, different ways of looking at it, all of which have some insight, are helpful in some way or to some groups of people. So watch this space for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that you started the Reforge the Ring podcast, and Andrea is actually coming to MetaFest.
Yes, she mentioned that. Yeah, and she's really looking forward to it. So I encourage people to seek out Andrea and have some chats on these topics if they're listening to this.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Just having this wiki with the list of concepts and the ideas behind the Metacrisis and aggregating projects is already, I think, a big value unlock.
Yeah, and I hope that in the future there will be more collaboration across projects. I suspect that many of the projects that applied for the first quadratic funding round weren't aware of each other. So there's a kind of discovery process going on. Reforge the Ring, for example, has we've made good friends with Mycelia or DSDAO.xyz, who are working on, well, their project was called Indigenous Public Goods for Global Coordination. They have very good connections with indigenous people, particularly in Brazil, and they alerted me to the fact there's some really interesting thinking coming from indigenous people about Web3. There's a, what's it called, the I think it's Cyber Indigenous Manifesto. I'll find the link anyway, or I'm sure it's available on myceliauni.substack.com. Yeah, we'll find it. But so indigenous folks have actually written this kind of like manifesto of how they would like to use and be included in Web3 and in the future of the internet. And I thought that was super interesting because very often we think of indigenous peoples as being more connected to kind of ancient technologies rather than future ones. But this is starting to change in some cases, and I think there's very likely lots of useful insights that will come out of such communities.
Awesome. Yeah, I've seen a bunch of cool projects listed in the Metacrisis around. I was like, oh, I didn't know this exists. So that's definitely a good point and definitely useful. So, yeah, is there any other one of your projects that you would like to touch on before we start wrapping it up?
So one thing I haven't mentioned actually is Futurecraft residencies. So I ran the first one of these a couple of months ago in the southwest of the UK, and we'll be running another Futurecraft residency in Costa Rica in December at a place called Brave Earth, which is one of the most incredible places on the planet as far as I'm concerned. It's like a small regenerative eco-village a couple of hours north of San Jose that are doing a fantastic job of including and supporting the local population, as well as gathering all kinds of interesting medicine holders and wisdom keepers from across the globe. And the founders also are very kind of thoughtful, politically engaged types. One of the co-founders, a friend of mine, Alma Lodher, has just co-written a book called Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, which I highly, highly recommend. Next Futurecraft residency will happen in Costa Rica at Brave Earth. It's going to be a week long, and we're going to have lots of juicy conversations about AI, Web3, DAOs, kind of cutting edge technologies of the future. But I co-facilitate it also with my dear friend Anna Ling, who is a yoga instructor and choir leader. So we do plenty of like movement and singing. My friend Jay, who thinks a lot about imagination, the nature of creativity, and the future of education, and brings some fantastic content on those topics. And finally, my partner Laura, who brings authentic relating, group dialogue practices, and the various ways of helping us attune to the group, to become sensitive to the group field. So we got great feedback on this, on the first residency that we did, and really looking forward to doing this again in Costa Rica soon. And I mention it because it kind of connects with what we were saying earlier in the call about like the importance of both inner and outer development in seeking some, if not resolution, like progress on the Metacrisis. Yes, it's super important to be thinking about these new coordination mechanisms and how can we use Web3 to deal with things like multipolar traps and so on. But there's also a really important piece about just becoming really excellent human beings and learning how to be kind and understanding to one another. And that is, both of those things are present, are a focus of these Futurecraft residencies. So I wonder whether there might be a few people, maybe including yourself, Pete, who are kind of attracted by that mix. And if so, look out for that.
Yeah, honestly, sounds great. And if you're still accepting people, I will include it in the podcast show notes as well.
Yes, well, actually, it's not even live, actually, the event page for the next one, but it will be very soon. So, we can certainly direct people to somewhere where they will be able to find out. In many ways, it sounds like it has a lot in common with MetaFest, and I'm gutted I won't be able to be at MetaFest. I have another commitment, Medicine Festival in the UK. But I feel like there's real gold here in this like coming together of different tribes in the way that you're organising there. Yeah, and in the very particular context, right, of what have we had, like record global temperatures for 4 days in a row at the time of speaking. It's Bayo Akomolafe, a very interesting thinker, philosopher, says the times are urgent, so let us slow down. I think it's important that we take note that on many fronts we are reaching really critical points. Certainly, when we think of climate and the ecological crisis, that doesn't mean we should just kind of rush into things and and freak out. I think it does mean, however, that we should ask some really hard questions about the work that we're doing. For example, folks in the Web3 space, and I include myself in that, about are we truly convinced this is kind of aligned with flourishing of life on this planet and a thriving future for humanity? Because it seems to me that we do need all hands on deck at this point, and all kind of really working for a thriving future. And there's the positives of the bear market has been that it's killed off a whole load of greed and bullshit in the Web3 community, which is good news as far as I'm concerned. There's still quite a lot left. So the more of that we can, that can just fall away, and we can be left with a kind of Web3 that feels like truly aligned with the good of all life on this planet, the better. And one simple way for that to happen is for each of us that are working in this space to just tune in with is what I'm doing truly valuable? So I'm sure lots of these juicy conversations will happen at MetaFest. So looking forward to hearing how that goes over the next weeks.
Yeah, that's one of the big parts of metagame. Thinking about okay, so why does this matter? What's the bigger picture behind this? And then educating the people who don't know it, because especially in the Balkans, there's people. I mean, in general, I think the people have a not good idea of crypto. So, with all the scams and the hype and not so many useful things coming out, at least not in a visible way. It's just the whole vision has gotten murky, both for the people who are in the space as well as people outside the space. So I think it's important, and the bear market is cleansing. I like it. Really
appreciate the time and space, mental space, just to kind of go back to first principles, because it's so attractive, addictive, even to the best of us. When prices are rising and feels like everyone's flying, but in many cases it is simply a distraction and an illusion, right? And just because number go up does not mean we're necessarily having any meaningful and sustainable impact on the thriving of life on this planet. And I'm grateful to you for this, for hosting this, not just this episode, but all of the episodes that you've hosted on this podcast, where you've been asking some really important questions, and great to hear that that's happening in the context of metagame as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and this was great. And we're still a niche within a niche, but I really think we can grow this thing.
Yeah, me too. Nice. Well, thanks for having me, and speak to you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on, and talk to you soon. Have a great day.